participants as well. Our speaker, Jorge Sebastiao, international ICT speaker, and we have... Yes, we can see your presentation. Please go ahead, George.
Oh, okay, please. Sure. Okay. So in the next few minutes, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an appreciation about data as the new oil from a practical and framework architecture perspective. So first thing that is important, I think data is driving the new economy, and it really matters a lot the type of company that you are, because you need to make this necessary transformation. Obviously, you have to be the likes of companies like Uber or Airbnb that have become pretty much virtual companies. But to be data-driven does not necessarily mean you're a pure virtual company. We have other ones, like, for example, Tesla, which are not virtual companies, but are making data a key element of their entire strategy. And there's some that are hybrids somewhere between, like LinkedIn and so on. In order for us to take advantage of this framework, I think there's many elements that need to be addressed. I think that we need to understand the challenges, the scope. We need to put an overall way of validating how we bring this to our organizations, pilot, and much more important than that, actually being have a structure that is capable of scaling it up as much as possible. In order for us to be able to do that, we need to address four major elements. One is the collection, sensing, or capturing of the data. Second element is obviously normalizing this data and moving it to a platform where we can use it, store it, analyze it. And it's quite interesting because the previous presenters were talking about artificial intelligence. We can look at it as an evolution that is extremely important. And more important than that is the actions that we take and how fast we take these actions on this data that will actually make the difference in itself. So how do we go about capturing this data? I mean, we are familiar with the traditional method, but obviously the users are becoming an important part of that, whether we use QR codes, we use fancy new headsets that actually provide translation, drones, or even satellites with the new accessibility of these meanings of capture, especially what we call microsatellites, are changing the whole face of how we capture and we use data in the future. Obviously, when we talk about IoT or IIoT or IoE, Internet of Everything, we're really trying to put an IP address on pretty much everything that makes our lives, whether it happens to be at home, at work, or in an industrialized or even transportation, medical, or other fields as we see. So there's a lot of vertical work that is being done in these areas. To go to the next thing, since we're capturing a lot more large amounts of data, how we transport this data becomes extremely important. Yes, we're familiar with cable means of transporting this data, fiber, and others, but obviously we need to simplify how we go about transporting this data. So new advancements, especially in the area of 5G and narrowband OIT, will make a big difference because it will simplify how we actually capture this data directly from the sensors, meaning that we could, for example, put a parking sensor somewhere, and this sensor will live for a period as long as 5 to 7 years, or even much more. Obviously, since the data is much larger, and we saw some of the earlier presenters talk about zettabytes, of course, we have gone through a whole bunch of revolutions, but I think the biggest revolution that is happening in data storage is that everything is pretty much becoming solid state. Even more important, we have moved away from deleting data. We simply don't worry about it. We keep as much data as possible. So the cloud has actually enabled us to see the data as something completely new, as a different approach. How do we go about processing it? In our cloud environments, we have now massive amounts of cloud capability. We're actually building very large great computers. One of the early presenters talked about blockchain. What is blockchain? It's a very large great computer that enables us to have access to that power. Some of it is obviously computing new numbers, but it goes much beyond that, because with the advent of things like smart contracts, we have now the capability to have access to that computing capabilities as well on the cloud, not just through the traditional cloud mechanisms that we saw in the past. But data only becomes useful when we actually visualize it in something that is practical to our everyday lives. So I think we need to do a lot of work on what I call the visualization or the usability of that data by the traditional users. And obviously, since we're talking about many participants from many countries from all over the world, each different user has different capabilities and different needs, and we need to cater to this to make this data fully accessible in a visual way. So when we take all these elements of adding value to this new oil, we really need to address all of these to combine together. So the sensing simplifies our complexity of collecting this data. By connecting all these things together in a much more virtualized way, we introduce much greater degrees of agility. AI and big data enables us to introduce new and continuous learning. But last important aspect is actually how we do with this data. So being able to introduce things like multimodal response to this data becomes extremely important and extremely valuable. But I think to leave with you, you can say a call of action as a result of this data is new oil. That really means you need to do not just digital transformation as we saw it in the past, is how we transform based on this innovation associated with data. So we need to look at new ways to reshape our organizations to actually take the advantage of this new data approach.